Now we're on Ayin Beis, Amud Beis. Mamatzinu b'treifa. The Gemara now presents the argument back and forth from the Chachamim to Rabbi Meir. And we start with the argument of the Chachamim. Shchitasa mitara. So we said that if you shecht an animal that's treif, let's say, for example, it has a punctured lung, then the shchita is mitar midei nevela, and the corpse of the dead animal is not mitame betumas nevela. Af shchitas behema titaris ha'ever. Right, he hasn't yet cut off the foreleg that was extended outside of the womb, so that foreleg is still connected to the fetus, and therefore, insofar as the shchita, the mother, is operative and valid vis-a-vis the fetus, then that foreleg is part of the fetus, and if it's part of the fetus, then the shchita of the mother, which includes the fetus, will now include the foreleg, because the foreleg is one entity together with the fetus, because you haven't yet severed that limb, and therefore the shchita will be mitayr, it'll, so to speak, purify that limb from tumas nevela, and therefore, if there's any contact between the ubar, the flesh of the fetus, and the extended protruded foreleg, that is contact with a treifa and not contact with a nevela. And contact with a treifa does not generate tumah. Amalem Rabbi Meir, how does Rabbi Meir counter argue against the Chachamim? Lo, your logic is fallacious. Why? Im tiara shchitas treifa osa. You're right, and I don't deny that the shchita of a treifa is mitayer, the animal, davar shebegufa, that which is considered part of its own body. So you have an animal that's treif, it's got a hole in its lungs, and then you shecht it, and it's mitayer, the corpse of the animal. Midei tumas nevela, that I understand, because the animal is part of the goof of the mother. Tityrus ha'ever, davar she'ena gufa. The limb, the foreleg that was extended outside of the womb of its mother is a separate entity. It's not part of the goof of the mother, and therefore the shchita of the mother does not have any relationship to that foreleg. He says here, Rabbi Meir maintains that the limb is not considered part of the mother, whereas the Chachamim maintain that the limb is considered part of the mother. So again, it would be a fascinating Iyun Shir, to try to understand on a deeper level what's the source, the root of the Machlokes Shin Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim as to whether or not that extended limb is part of the fetus, and therefore ipso facto part of the mother's body. And I have a feeling that although on a biological level the foreleg is still alive and well, and the what should I say, the cerebral system of the fetus itself will still control that foreleg. Do you follow what I mean? So in that sense, it's part of the fetus. But Rabbi Meir's analysis is from a halachic level, not a biological level, but a physical level. I'm sorry, not a physical level, but a conceptual, legal level. And that means that once the foreleg was extended, then it becomes treifa, it's chutz le mechitzasa, and that makes it into a separate entity on a halachic legal level, in the theoretical world of halacha, even though clearly biologically it's still part of the fetus. Anyway, the Mishnah now picks up that which is kuli amalo pligi. Even Rabbeir agrees that the shchita of the mother on a treifa will be mitar the treifa medena. He'll be nine with treifa shchitasa mitarasa. And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah answers, behema tmea asur b'achila. Okay, so now what's a behema tmea? Behema tmea doesn't mean tumah, but behema tmea means a non-kosher animal, like a camel or a swine, and it's asur b'achila. So the Torah says non-kosher animals you're not allowed to eat. Now, treifa, although it belongs to a species of a kosher animal, but because it became a treifa, you're not allowed to eat the flesh of a treifa. So therefore, we should really generate an equation, an analogy between a behemoth tmeah, meaning a non-kosher animal, and a treifa, which likewise is asur b'achila. And therefore, ma behemoth tmeah ein shchitasa mitarasa, af treifa lo titarenu, lo titarenu shchita. I would argue logically that just like in the case of a non-kosher animal, the shchita has no impact on removing or preventing the chalos nevela, as far as tumas nevela is concerned. And even if you shecht a pig, or if you shecht a camel, etc., the pegata, the dead corpse, is going to be metame tumas nevela. The shechita is totally meaningless. So let's apply the same logic, the same yardstick to a treifa, right? The treifa is asur b'achila, like a non-kosher species, and therefore the shechita should not be meaningful at all vis-a-vis the treifa, and therefore it should be metame tumas nevela. Lo, now we have to come along and differentiate between a non-kosher animal and a treifa of a kosher species. You're right that with regard to a behemoth tmeah, the shchita is totally meaningless, and it cannot be mitayr. The pegata swine is going to be mitame tumas nevela, but shalohoi solo shasa kosher, because there was never a moment in time when you could have shechted and permitted the consumption of the flesh of a non-kosher animal. Tomar, but you want to equate it by analogy to a treifa. Shahoisol shas kosher. At least a treifa, before it became, it swallowed a nail or a screw, it was a healthy animal, and you could have shechted it and eaten its meat. So therefore, we're going to say that the shechita is meaningful for a treifa. It could have been a full-fledged, meaningful shechita before the animal punctured its lungs. And after it punctures its lungs, then we lower it by one notch, and the shechita is not poil, it doesn't effectuate a heter consumption, but chutz, it's a valid shechita of a kosher animal in order to generate tara, in order to prevent nevel. Gemara says that's not enough. Tolach mashe vesa, meaning let's try to see if your proof holds water. Let's analyze whether we can accept your proof, your logic. Haresha nolda treifa mina beten minayin. What happens if an animal became treifa in the fetal stage? By the way, Steve, did you ever hear the name Dr. Howie Apfel? No, he's a Rebbe in a yeshiva in Yerushalayim, very similar to Mevaseret, or the old Mevaseret anyway, which is called Torah Shraga. So anyway, he is a pediatric surgeon. He's mamish like the Rambam, Torah and medicine. There's a very famous picture of him. He does surgery on an embryo before it's born, and it's a very famous picture. They use it for the anti-abortion, you know, political movement because he shows you that after he performed surgery on the fetus actually, and there's a picture, is holding on to his finger. And then the fetus goes back into the mother's womb and lives out another full 9 months. Anyway, so now what we're saying is, what happens if you have a treifa in utero? Which, as I said before, you can do surgery on the fetus. So now this this fetus could never ever lend itself to a het shchita because it's a treifa. There's no het shchita as far as achil is concerned, and therefore, ipso facto, we would have to say that it's similar to a non-kosher animal which never ever had a shasak kosher, it never lent itself to shchita. So, are you going to tell me now that if there's a fetus that's a treifa in utero, then it would not be subject to the tahara process of shchita, to be mitar b'dei nevela? That's not true. We know that the halacha says the following, that a kosher animal, if it belongs to a kosher species, then even though it's a treifa, the shchita is meaningful to be mitar b'dei nevela. Lo. Let's go back to the species. And even though this particular fetus is a treifa from the get-go, but nevertheless it belongs to a species of a kosher animal, and therefore the shchita is meaningful. But now the Mishnah says we still have a problem. And that is ben shmona chai. Ein shchita mitarasa lefisha ein b'mina shchita. Gemara says the following: that b'mina shchita is called tsonu bakar in the Torah. That's what Rashi quotes. So as far as the het shchita is concerned, the shchita is only meaningful for tsonu bakar, anything similar to tsonu bakar that belongs to a species of a kosher animal. But if you have a ben shmona, a fetus that's born alive after 8 months of gestation, I think it's called, when the normal gestation for tsonu bakar is 9 months, an 8th month fetus of a cow, which is a kosher animal, or for example, in the case of a sheep or a goat, which has 5 months of gestation, and now you find the fetus of a sheep or goat that's only 4 months old, that's called a nefel. It's non-viable. And a nefel is not considered tson ubakar. It's like a min unto itself. It's like a non-kosher species. And therefore, this nefel, even after shchita, will be metame tumas nevela. Okay. Now we go on to the Gemara. We should make a siyum on this Mishnah that we just learned. And the Gemara says the following. It would seem that there's no machlokas between Reb Meir and the Chachamim in the Seifa as to whether or not the fetus contracts tumah. And the machlokas is only whether the fetus is in contact with a nevela. Nevela meaning, because once he severs that foreleg that was protruding outside the womb, that foreleg now becomes a nevela according to Rabbi Meir. Or shall we say the foreleg is a treifa according to the Chacham? But nobody argues that there should be some contact of hametame between the fetus and the foreleg. Amai, why is that so? Tumas beis hastarim, even tumas beis hastarim lo mitame. The contact between the fetus and the protruding leg is sort of like below the surface, so it's not exposed, it's not revealed, it's concealed, and that's called beis hastarim. And there's no such thing as tumas beis hastarim, the Gemara thinks. So the Gemara wants to say, Lema, should we now argue that Reb Meir and the Chachamim both agree to the following position, which is Reb Meir's famous position, as we'll soon see in a Mishnah in Tumas Medris. I'm not exactly sure. I think the Mishnah is in Kalin, but anyway, in Kalin. That Tumas beis hastarim is mitame, and maybe the Chachamim in our Mishnah agree to Rabbi Meir. We're going to soon see that the Mishnah is going to record a machlokas about beis hastarim between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Yossi should not be identified with the Chachamim in our Mishnah. The Chachamim in our Mishnah agree fundamentally that Tumas beis hastarim, when it's concealed, would transmit Tumah. But Rabbi Yossi has a different shita, but he doesn't appear at all in our Mishnah. Desnan, we learned in a Mishnah in Masechta Kelim. Now, by way of introduction, we're talking about Tumas Medrash, like a Zav or a Zava or what else? A Zav. Just one second. A Zav, a Zava, and I believe a Nida. Oh yeah, and Yoledes. Any of those four, if they rest on a bed, the bed is Tamei Tumas Medris, which means it has the status of an Ava Tuma, and it's Metame Oda V'Keli. But that's only if the bed has a certain dimension. And it's called Roy L'Shchiva. That's where you normally would lie down. So it's got the tomb of Medris. Medris means lying down, reclining. Now, the minimum shear for any stretch of a garment to be Roy for Shchiva and therefore susceptible to Tumas Medris is 3 by 3 tfachim. That's very important to add the word tfachim here, because we're going to see that with the exception of Tumas Medris, we have Tumas Begadim, and a beged, a cloth, in order to qualify as a beged, has to be 3 by 3 etzbos, which is much less than 3 by 3 tefachim. Anyway, shlosha al shlosha shenechak. What happens if you had a bed, in quotation marks, inverted commas, right? That means you had a cloth that was 3 by 3 tefachim, and the nida, etc., sat and reclined on that bed, on that cloth. So that cloth is 3 by 3 tefachim, and therefore it has tumas medris. And then you split it in half. Once you split it in half, each segment is smaller than 3 by 3 tefachim. It's tar min medris. So you've now eliminated. You flew away, you threw away the Tumas Medris. But don't think that therefore it's tar. Why? Aval Tame Maga Medris. Divrei Meir holds that since each segment was at one point attached to another one, through the fibers, that underlie the cloth, therefore each segment is maga, it has a contact with the Tumas Medris, meaning right before you cut it, and at that point you split it in half, each half was touching something that had already Tumas Medris. And therefore, we have what's called Tumas Maga. Now, Tumas Maga is what we call a Rishon L'Tum. A rishon l'tuma is mitame ochlin umashkin, but not on the mekalim. So you successfully lowered the level of tuma from tumas medris, which is an avatuma, down to the level of magatum. Oh, now we come to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is going to argue that Rabbi Meir's case is a case of tumas beis hastorim, because the contact between the two parts of this cloth, as we said before, is in the fibers below the surface. So that's called concealed. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi is going to argue that there's no tumas maga. And once you cut the gimel by gimel tfachim in half, and you remove the tumas measures, there is no tumas maga. Amar Rabbi Yossi, v'chi be'eza midras nagam zeh. Where's the maga? Where's the contact? In other words, the contact here is like below the surface. Let's just see if he points that out here. Oh, beautiful. He quotes Rashi, the segments touch one another only beneath the surface of the cloth. Again, you have to understand the physics here. But anyway, Tumah cannot be transmitted through a concealed area beis hastorim. So the machlokas here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi is about whether Tumah's beis hastorim is metame or not metame. But says Rabbi Yossi, have to add a proviso here. It could be very possible that the split cloth would be Tomei Tumas Maga. How? Elashim Naga Bozav Shehei Tomei Magazav. If a Zav would now come in contact with any of these two segments after you divide the Gimel by Gimel Tfachim, and each one of the segments has Gimel by Gimel etzbos, which is a shame beged, and therefore the Zav, through his contact with the Gimel al Gimel etzbos, that cloth, he transmits Tumas Maga. So Rabbi Yossi says, I agree with you, Rabbi, that there is a possibility that each segment would be Tomei Tumas Maga, but not because of its contact with the medras, because that's Tumas Beis Hastorim, but rather with the contact with a Zav who actually, touched the segment which was 3 by 3 exposed. So where are we holding now in terms of our Mishnah? That now we're going to say that our Mishnah is predicated on the sheet of Rabbi Meir that Tumas Beis Hastorim is metame, and even the Chachamim of our Mishnah agree that it's metame, and it's called Maga, even though it's Beis Hastorim, because if you remember, the Ubar is inside its mother. And not only that, the connection between the Ubar and the foreleg is also Beis Hastorim. And therefore our Mishnah, although both the Chachamim and Reb Meir concede and accept the principle that Tumas Beis Hastorim is metame, but nevertheless Reb Yossi is against our Mishnah. In other words, the very premise of our Mishnah would be rejected by Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, no. You know what? I don't think that you've convinced me. Lavit marlo, amar ula, lo shanu el shlosha shenechla. Right, there were 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. That was tomei tumas medrash, and then you split it down the middle. So now, you see, until now we've been speaking about 2 levels of garments. We have a garment that's 3 by 3 tfachim for the shear of medrash, and then we have a garment of 3 by 3 finger breadths, which is sholosh al sholosh etzbos for a shem beged for tumas maga. But now on the top of the totem pole, we're going to add a third size or shear of a beged. That's called a beged gadol. Aval sholosh al sholosh habos mi beged gadol. Beged gadol means a large garment, and it's so large that even after you split it down the middle, each segment has 3 by 3 tfachim. So again, we have to go through the minute details, but the bottom line of this sugya of Lav Itmar Allah, Amar Ula, is that even Rabbi Yossi could agree in our Mishnah that the fetus will acquire tumah, and it's not Beis Hastorim. So when does Rabbi Yossi argue against Rabbi Meir? In the case where he split the 3 by 3 tfachim medris, that's in a case where after you split the beged, which was 3 by 3 tfachim, you're left with segments that are less than 3 by 3 tfachim. So you don't have the shear for tumas medris. Now, in that case, Rabbi Yossi argues that since you cut the beged in half, then the contact between the two parts of the beged is called tumas beis hastarim. It's concealed. But what would Rabbi Yossi say? That's Ula's argument. In a case where you had a very large garment, and even after you cut the garment, you're still left with 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim. Now, the original large garment was, laid upon, reclined upon by a zav, etc., and it had tumas medris. So here, in this case of a large garment, where even after you sever it down the middle, you still have 3 by 3 tfachim, then Rabbi Yossi would agree that you have maga with a medris. And that's called V'shas Prishasa Me'avia Mekablos Tuma Me'avia. Let me just read to you the footnote and then we'll end the shir with Ravina. It is inevitable that as a segment of cloth is cut from another piece, the edge of the severed piece touches the edge of the source piece before it's completely removed. Thus, if the original garment was a medrash and measured 3 by 3 tefachim, even after the segment is cut off, the segment acquires tuma, again mada, by touching a midrash as it's being severed. And even Rabbi Yossi, who disregards contact in a beis hastorim, a concealed area, concedes that tuma is acquired in this case since the contact occurs between the exposed edges of cloth and not between the concealed fibers. There's a lot of physics over here. And therefore, Hanami, now the Gemara wants to apply this to our Mishnah in order to reconcile the Chachamim of our Mishnah with Rabbi Yossi. At the moment that you separate the limb, the protruded limb from the fetus, the flesh of the fetus, right, will acquire tumah from that limb, even according to Rabbi Yossi. The contact occurs between surfaces that become exposed during the severing. So they're exposed, and therefore it's not tumas beis hastorim. And Ravina Omer, he has an alternative explanation for our Mishnah. Beged lav l'chaticha koi, but ubar l'chaticha koi. Komay lachtoch kechatuch dami. That a garment doesn't necessarily stand to be cut, and that's why Rabbi Yossi holds that it's tumas beis hastorim. But in the case of an ubar, we don't call it beis hastorim because the foreleg that extended beyond the womb of its mother is omed lachtoch. Why is it omed lachtoch? Because it's osur b'achila, so therefore he's going to cut it off. And now Ravina formulates a principle which the Gemara is going to analyze. Kol omed lachtoch kechatuch dami. It's legally considered as though it's already severed. Thus, the point of contact between the two portions of the limb is regarded as though it's revealed even before the protruding portion is actually severed. And since the surfaces touch each other in a revealed area before the severing, the non-protruding portion acquires tumah through contact with the protruding portion. So the flesh of the fetus is tameh, even according to Rabbi Yossi, and that's the Chachamim Shita in our Mishnah, that it's contact with a treifa. And now the Gemara is going to analyze, how do we know this principle that kol omed lachtoch kechatuch dami? So Mirza Hashem, tomorrow, which is Shabbos, we do Daf Ayin Gimel, correct?